And now we're coming back to our main topic. The Deputy Speaker of Slovakian Parliament, Andrej Danko, arrived in Moscow today as Bratislava seeks a solution to Ukraine's decision to halt Russian gas deliveries to Europe. With Ukraine refusing to renew a transit deal with Russia, is it even possible for Slovakia to get Russian gas by an alternative method? And how eager is Moscow to make the effort for its Eastern European friends? To discuss this issue, we're joined now by Vladimir Milov, a former Russian deputy energy minister and a former advisor to the deceased Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure is ours. So Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico said that Russian President Vladimir Putin promised that Russia's state gas company Gazprom would find an alternative way to deliver contracted gas to Slovakia. Will Moscow agree on this? Looking at the recent protests against the pro-Russian stance on the Slovak government, it might seem vital for Mr. Fico to secure gas supplies for the Slovaks, right?
I'm absolutely sure that Moscow made a prearranged agreement with Fico's government to continue the uninterrupted supplies of gas to Slovakia, which is most certainly going on right now. There is available capacity for this through Turkish Stream pipeline that runs through Black Sea, through the Turkish territory and further on to the Balkans and Central Europe. I'm absolutely confident that Slovakia gets the gas, and Gazprom itself is very much interested in continued uninterrupted flow of gas to Hungary, Slovakia and other European countries which still continue to buy it. Because European exports is still very much profitable. That's the only thing that keeps Gazprom afloat these days. Energy exports to China are not generating any significant profits, so Gazprom needs continued sales to Hungary, Slovakia, Italy, whichever European countries are ready to buy it. I think what happens in public right now is this specifically played out drama to portray Ukraine as a hostile party which interrupts the security of energy supplies to Europe. But I'm pretty sure that Slovakia gets the gas all right.
All right, we see. And so what is the significance and the meaning of the follow-up visit now organized by the delegation of the Slovak parliament?
If you actually consider the long-term standing of the Fico party in Slovakia and its coalition partners and its other European allies like Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, what they want to do is they want to continue portraying the partnership with Moscow, with the Kremlin as something solid, pragmatic, and the policies of European Union, Brussels, which are continuing to support Ukraine in the war with Russia and against the Russian aggression, as something which is out of touch with pragmatic interests of the countries that they represent. So they want to portray a contrast, the smooth, pragmatic cooperation with Moscow versus Brussels injecting into more money towards the aid for Ukraine. I think that's the game, and Russia is very much welcoming that. They do not waste any warm words for European governments who still want to maintain contacts with Moscow. So again, this is played very much for PR to stir the public sentiment that it's a good thing to come back to business as usual with Putin.
I will come back on that later. But in light of what you're saying, since the invasion of Ukraine, both Slovakia and Hungary were perceived as pro-Russian. Serbia was even referred to as Moscow's fifth column. But things have begun to change. And when it started with Serbs limiting their purchases of Russian weapons. So now, how important are the European ties to Russia? And what could the loss of another ally mean to Moscow?
I wouldn't rush to judge that Moscow has lost an important European ally in terms of Alexander Vučić, the leader of Serbia. Yes, Serbian government does make certain steps back when being pressured by the West in terms of too much cooperation with Russia, like purchases of Russian arms, or most recently, like recent United States sanctions against Gazprom subsidiary in Serbia, which basically prompt Serbian government to consider buying off these assets from Gazprom. So Serbia yields to some pressure, but generally we see a widespread cooperation. also between security services of Russia and Serbia. We know certain cases where Serbian government actually helped Russia to persecute political activists who fled and resided in Belgrade in Serbia, escaping the persecution from the Russian government. Actually, Serb authorities assisted Russian government to get these people. So the cooperation goes on, and what you see are just, some headlines related to Serbian government yielding to Western pressure about too much cooperating with Russia. But generally, they still pretty much pro-Russian as they were, and there should be no illusions about that.
It's interesting from the Polish EU enlargement goals point of view. But you've mentioned that before. I will come back to this business as usual with European leaders. Alice Weidel, AfD leader, said during the party congress lately that she would restore Russian Nord Stream. As she put it, we want the Nord Stream be put back in operation. So clearly the energy pricing is a highly sensitive issue for Germany. How likely do you think the business as usual comeback scenario would be, with the AfD scoring second in the polls?
Hopefully not likely, because nobody wants to enter coalition talks with AfD in Germany, and they don't have any real prospects of coming to power. But Russians and their useful idiots in Europe, sorry for the term, but they will continue to push on this issue of war fatigue, of economic difficulties that were prompted by European decoupling from the Russian gas. Objectively, there are difficulties, no question about that. So Putin's propaganda will again waste no time in pushing these buttons and saying, listen, we can come back to, you just have to surrender Ukraine, you just have to surrender the idea of defending democracy and rules-based international order, but you'll get cheap gas in return. So Putin's propaganda will tirelessly exploit this war fatigue and fatigue with economic difficulties in all the European Union member states where we see elections and difficult political process. It's not just about AfD. You see same propaganda lines in every EU member state. Russians are always supporting this notion that you just need to turn the page, forget about Ukraine, and you get cheap gas. We see many pro-Putin forces across Europe basically picking up this propaganda line.
Okay, so what tools do the Russians use to implement their propaganda in the countries considered hostile to their line of policy?
The smart thing about what Russians are doing is that they often do not interfere directly. They actually capitalize on some fractures and problems that does exist in the politics of democratic countries, and there are many issues like economic difficulties also caused by decoupling from Russian energy and increased military spending and aid to Ukraine. There are issues like migration, which Russia and its ally Lukashenko's Belarus have been weaponizing in big way. So there are all these difficulties with which voters in European member states are not happy about. And Russians are trying to push on these buttons to stir the controversy, to finance social media and media campaigns, and to support the politicians who keep stirring these difficulties with basic goal to act against mainstream European politicians who stay firm on the democratic course, on the course of supporting Ukraine, resisting Putin's aggression. So Russia wants to use all these cracks, difficulties to support the forces that go against the mainstream, and for normalizing Russia, normalizing Putin's dictatorship, normalizing aggression, again, for the sake of returning to Russian cheap gas. Basically, that's the key point, exploiting the difficulties to creating some space to stir the political developments against the mainstream pro-Ukrainian democratic forces.
As we are just heading to the wrap-up, I would like to ask you a question about Poland, since its authorities have just published a report on the fight against Russian and Belarusian disinformation. So the situation is particularly sensitive right now ahead of the presidential elections coming up. It turns out that the Russians have planned to destabilize the situation in Poland and influence this election. So how real is this threat, and can it be effectively countered?
We have multiple cases of documented Russian interference in various countries, not only in Europe but across the Atlantic as well. So Poland is a very strong and potent adversary to Putin, the country which was standing firm for all these years in defending democratic values, defending Ukraine against aggression. Definitely Poland is one of the priorities in all these hybrid warfare and disinformation campaigns. What is the objective here is to stir controversy, to multiply conflicts. Not necessarily that Putin sees the forces competing for presidency or governance as pro-Russian, but what they want is they want to see more conflict, which makes the whole system less functional. That's their objective. So they would want to capitalize on any possible differences, spread all kinds of disinformation. Particularly, I think one of the issues where Moscow will be hitting at is fatigue with very important and a large-scale support for Ukraine, with inflow of Ukrainian refugees. They will try to point at that as the cost, obviously, that Poland is paying for supporting Ukraine and try to stir negative sentiment against it. I think that will be one of the main objectives of the Kremlin's propaganda.
Thank you so much for your comments tonight. Vladimir Milov, a former Russian deputy energy minister, was our guest tonight. Thank you again.
Thank you.